won't leave me alone. Will you see yourself back in the sun? The light it stings while the night it sings to me. And I'm normal how a story I can't tell, but they'll see the gift they've given to me. I could step aside, I could end this life, but this disease, it won't release, it won't be cured by the night. I guess I'm never coming back. I'm on and on.
Good evening and welcome to the St. Pete by Night Entertainment Network. St. Petersburg by Night is a massive multiplayer 5th edition World of Darkness chronicle set in the city of St. Petersburg, Florida, including Vampire the Masquerade, including Hunter the Reckoning, and including Werewolf the Apocalypse. But tonight is Saturday night, and you know what that means. It's time for After Dark, and After Dark is our behind-the-scenes program where we talk to the movers and shakers in the world of darkness, including storytellers, including players, including authors. And tonight we have a very special guest, and I'm excited to talk to them. My name is Kent, also known as Misha Kent on all social media. I am normally the lead storyteller of St. Pete by Night, but tonight I play the role of host, and I get to talk to one rather incredible individual. I am talking to Neal Litherland, aka the Literary Mercenary. Neal is an author, a blogger, a podcaster, a content creator, and an overall jack of all trades. He has written supplements for Pathfinder, the World of Darkness, and is a contributing writer to the Army Men TTRPG that we spoke about just 2 weeks ago here on After Dark, plus much, much more. You can also check out his YouTube series, Discussions of Darkness, over on his YouTube channel, which is linked in the description. We'll be talking about that, plus a whole lot more tonight. But right now, let's allow Neal to introduce himself. Neal, say hello.
Thank you very much for having me, and a pleasure to meet all the folks out there, those who are familiar with my work and those who aren't. As was mentioned, I'm a TTRPG writer, I'm an author, I do audio dramas, I do several shows on YouTube for those who have seen either Discussions of Darkness, if you're a part of the World of Darkness community, or if you've checked out Tactical Plastic Report, if you're a fan of Army Men, or if you've seen Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about Sundara Dawn of a New Age. But there's probably going on a decade and change of my content out there at this point, so if you're interested, there's plenty of stuff to dig through, for sale, in bundles, and just for free floating around out there.
One of the things we love here on After Dark is origin stories, and you've got two of them that I would love to hear. Your origin of TTRPGs and your origin of writing. But we're going to start with TTRPGs. How did you first hear about TTRPGs, and how did you first get into playing them? When did they first enter into your zeitgeist, or how did you first get exposed to them?
This is actually a story, I've had a few other people ask me about it, and I never get tired of telling it, because it's one of those ships passing in the night, and it took 3 tries to get me into the hobby, which is now my actual job. But years and years and years ago, when dinosaurs walked the earth and I was in middle school, I had a friend of mine who was very into RPGs, but didn't really communicate to me what they were, and I thought they were just a thing he had made up himself. And I didn't really have any context. It was like a 1v1 GM and player sort of story game, and I'm like, I have no idea what this is. I'm not really sure what's going on, but I'm enjoying myself. I'm having fun with this. And it was one of those things. We played it for a couple of months, and then he got consumed with another project. I mostly forgot about it. And then he eventually moved away and whatnot. I didn't really have any other friends who played those kinds of games. And then several years later, back when malls were open and they always had a B. Dalton and a Walden Books across from each other, I was at the discount aisle in Walden Books, and they had the Dungeons and Dragons Red Box for the second edition. And I had no clue what it was. I just saw it was on sale and it had cool art on it. So I used like the $10 my mother had given me to get me something to entertain myself with, and I took a gamble and I brought it home and I opened it up and I had no clue what I was looking at. You know, and I tried reading it, I tried understanding it. I saw it had a bunch of cool dice in it. That was fun. And there was some kind of character dossier. I wasn't really sure what it was. And I and my friends at the time had that same issue of we tried to run it not knowing that the intro mission was meant for a party of four. So clearly one character was just getting wrecked by everything we tried. And we're like, this game sucks. I don't know what this is. So I put it all back together and I shoved it under my bed and I forgot about it. Fast forward to my freshman year of college. I'm in whatever poli sci class I had to take because I don't remember. But there's a guy who was, he was a returning student, so he was an older guy, and we're having chats in between classes and whatnot. And he's like, "Hey, you seem like the kind of guy who might like this. I want you to meet some of my friends. We're gonna get together. We're gonna do this thing." I'm like, "What is it?" Just trust me, you'll like it. We're gonna get together and play a game. And I'm like, "All right, this is dubious, and it's how horror movies start, but I'm game for this." And then I show up, and it's table playing. It was right on the cusp of the D&D 3.0 to 3.5 transition. And I sit down and I'm playing it and I start getting flashbacks of, oh, I remember these. I had this. This is a character sheet. That's what this is called. And I know these dice. I have a set of these dice. And as I actually start watching the group play, I'm like, oh, this is why it went so terribly. Because we didn't have four people who knew what they were doing who had a plan. We had like two people who were trying to figure it out, like in and of themselves. And after that, it was just like, so when are we getting the next game together? And that was kind of the real way I made friends in college. And then later on, is I would meet people at the local gaming store or I would meet people at LARPs. And that was kind of the basis for a lot of my friend circle. So it just kind of became a thing of who's running what. Let's join that game.
I got exposed to a lot of games really early on. It sounds like you got exposed to a lot of games as well, which is a good thing. Uh, Continuing on from there, what about writing? How did you get introduced to writing early on? Like, what was kind of your introduction into writing? How did you get started with that?
I have a very particular memory in my mind that it was like before this, it was a thing of writing was an activity that I would do, when there was an assignment or when there was extra credit or whatnot. And then after that, it was when I started doing it on my own for my own enjoyment. There was this will tie back later on. This is what we call foreshadowing. I found a collection of horror audio dramas in my grandparents' garage that were probably a little more mature than I should have been given access to, but my parents didn't care. It was like reading with your ears. And in it they had a short story called Lizard Man by Robert R. McGammon, which is it's a story about a guy in the Florida swamps who is a lizard man. He hunts alligators, and it's him going after the local urban legend of the old pope, this gigantic alligator that he's going to bring in. He's going to make history that night. And without spoiling the story, there is a line that hooked me and that kept my imagination of, and that's when the lizard man knew the old pope was not an alligator. And it's like these stories were just rolling around in me, and I had messed up a test at some point, and that my English class had a thing where you could write a short story using all of your vocabulary words, and you get whatever the bonus credit was. And so it was not the first time I had attempted an assignment like that. Kids would get assignments like that all the time in the classes I was in. But the particular set of vocabulary words we had overlaid really nicely, and I did kind of my own version of that story. It was a found journal horror story set in the Amazon, and we're following along in the footsteps of a research team who was going, up the river trying to find the source of the legends of certain like monstrous animals. And when we find, the last journal entry, it's like, I don't know what this thing is, but it is not a crocodile. Get out before it finds you. And it was the first time because I had, classmates who had read some of my work be like, "Oh, that was fun. I liked that. That was nice." It was the first time an adult had sat me down and gone, "That was really upsetting." I was like, "Oh, I can affect grown-ups with my work. I got to do more of this."
Yeah. Did you find that the two came together pretty naturally and pretty quickly, like the TTRPG and the writing? Did they almost immediately intertwine, or did you find that it kind of took time for the two hobbies to come together?
It was actually my love of writing and storytelling that got me as hard into TTRPGs as it did.
Okay.
Because I'd played a lot of like console RPGs and PC RPGs before that. And while they weren't bad, they had the same frustration that every gamer has ever had of, but I have a solution that the programmer didn't put into this game, so I have to follow the path that they laid out for me to do the thing. Whereas in an RPG, I could just look at whoever was running it and be like, I have a dumb idea. I want to try this. And then they'll either tell me it's like, no, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to let you do that. Or that sounds extra ridiculous. Roll some dice. Let's see if it works. And that ability to sort of combine improv storytelling with a character at a fully fleshed background and kind of creating a mechanical framework for what my character was and wasn't capable of doing in game really hit a center spot in my brain. And the longer I did it, I won't say it was addictive because it wasn't one of those things where I just had to do it all the time, but it was one of my favorite escapes. And it would often be a thing I would do. Like if I was having trouble with a story framework or I was having trouble with a character, I would sit down and be like, all right, what abilities would I give them if I were running their sheet, if I wanted them to be in a game? And sometimes I would actually play the character. Sometimes I'd be like, "Oh, that was an interesting exercise. Now let's go back to actually writing their story."
Okay. What do you remember about your first World of Darkness experience? Like, so you got exposed to games really quickly and a variety of games. When did World of Darkness enter into that mix? Because if you're getting so many games all at once, it seems like that would be one of the big ones to come across at that time period. Because if it's around the same time period that I got exposed, which I'm assuming it is based off of the dating of things from what I'm hearing, it was a pretty popular game during that time period. So it probably came in pretty quickly, especially if you were getting a lot of games rapid fire around that time period.
It's like I came into it early in my gaming career, but I came in at a weird time because I had, there's a whole weird backstory of my dropping out of college and running away from home and then going back home and then finishing college and eventually getting to where I am today. But while I was doing that, I had a regular D&D table that I had joined, and we'd kind of finished off the short little dungeon crawl we were doing, and somebody wanted to try this new game that had come out. The new game was, of course, Requiem instead of Masquerade.
Okay.
So, like, I kind of discovered the new World of Darkness like right when it was hitting because the controversy was getting everybody to be like, either we're going to play the older editions even harder now, or you'd have people going like, well, I like the old game, but I want to see what the new game has to offer. And that was the first time I had been at a table with a World of Darkness product. Though I realized about 2 or 3 sessions into it, it was not my first exposure because I had been one of the people who'd actually picked up the Hunter the Reckoning video games that they made. And
Okay.
it
Interesting.
wasn't until I started reading the text I'm like, wait a minute, I recognize some of these words. Oh crap, we're in that setting. I know things about this now. I have lore that I thought I was like coming in blind when I actually knew way more than I thought I did. So that was engaging.
So you did have kind of a previous exposure that you didn't realize was linked to a TTRPG setting through a video game, but it was kind of muddled up by a different version of the setting. I do appreciate though the fact that Chronicles was kind of your TTRPG exposure because Chronicles does get a lot of flack, including from me, because I was an old World of Darkness devotee, and I do give Chronicles a lot more flack than it deserves. But I was very hurt by the fact that it was brought to me as World of Darkness. That's how it was introduced to me, and that was its mistake. If it had been brought to me
Yeah.
as a new system and they weren't trying to sell it as World of Darkness, I probably would have taken it and been fine with it. But when they, reintroduced it as, hey, this is World of Darkness, it's felt like a continuation rather than something new, and that's where it burned me, and so I couldn't pick it up again. I couldn't accept it and outright rejected it. And now time has passed and I have started to come back around. But I do appreciate that you were kind of brought into it with fresh eyes and a willingness to kind of start from there. So what did you feel about being introduced through Chronicles of Darkness, and how was it? What about it hooked you? What about it made you want to explore more with World of Darkness?
Part of it was like I really liked the themes. I love modern fantasy, I love modern horror. I particularly have a love for, and this is, I cannot remember, I think it was Blood Shadows is the other game that I'm thinking of. I have never played it, but it was yet another weird coincidence of my grandfather came across this novel. For those who haven't played Blood Shadows, it's a modern fantasy occult noir sort of setting. It's very bonkers, but there was a tie-in novel that he had found and it patterned itself off of an old noir detective story. So we have our detective, looking down the alley, but instead of a bunch of gangsters, there's demons. And I see this as like a 15-year-old, and I'm like, this is amazing. And then I read it, and while it wasn't obviously a World of Darkness production, it had that same ickiness, that same feeling that I really liked, and it gave me an immediate grasp for the kind of stories that you could really tell with it. And because of that, there's that, and I'm also a huge sucker for tied-in universes. So the idea that we could run a Vampire Chronicle, finish that Chronicle, and then run a Chronicle for a completely different game, be like, okay, all that wild and crazy nonsense you just did, that's canon. You all have to deal with that now in this other sphere, which is, cheek by jowl of, even if you did that all as vampires, now you're playing Changeling. You have to deal with the fallout of all the stuff that you just did you thought was a great idea. And I really liked the idea that you could have things either be as big or as like small as you wanted them to be. I liked that scalability.
When did you end up going back? When did you end up discovering Old World of Darkness? Because it's interesting to me to find Chronicles first and then end up going backwards in time versus vice versa. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, obviously started with Old World of Darkness and then ended up discovering Chronicles versus the other way around. So how did that work for you in that timeline?
So I started with Requiem, and I had a very brief taste of it. My group played through like a very short chronicle, and I was like, that was good, but I need more. But they had already moved on; and they wanted to do something different, so I wasn't going to persuade them. And as I mentioned earlier, I moved back home and I got back into school and I finished my degree. And while I was doing that, I didn't exactly have a lot of free time, but I had some free weekends. And so I wanted to like get back in touch with some of my old friends. And a couple of them told me like, "Hey, there's this, weird thing where people dress up and they play a game." I'm like, "That sounds like it's up my alley. What is this?" And that was when I realized we had a One World by Night werewolf game, like right in my backyard. So I was like, ooh, that's fun. I never got to play werewolf. I'd like to try that out. And so I show up, and it was the first LARP I had done was as as an apocalypse player, and that was when people informed me like, oh, there's a LARP version of every one of the games, and I'm like, oh, this has unlocked an entire new opportunity that I didn't know I had. I'm gonna enjoy the hell out of this. And so I love universes that are tied together, and the idea that I could play one character in this game, go on a road trip with some friends, and play the same character in a completely different venue and meet completely different people was very intoxicating. I loved that idea. And so, once I moved on from Werewolf, because there were changes in staff, and people ran out of time, and various other reasons that you stopped going to a LARP. And then I found out there was they changed the name so many times. It was the Camarilla, and then it was something else, and then they changed it back to the Cam for a while, and I almost remembered what it was, and then it left me. But anyway, yeah, whatever the semi-official organization that did both Chronicles and original World of Darkness LARPs, I found some folks who were in that, and that was when I started playing Changeling. That was when I started doing. I had some friends who, well, speaking of Changeling, I'll be specific. I first started playing Lost, and then I had some friends who were doing a Dreaming LARP, and I was like, oh, I like Changeling, I'll try this out. So I'm reading Dreaming after reading Lost, and I'm like, these are two completely different games. It's like, so you don't want to play? No, no, I still want to play. This is just a completely different thing than I was expecting. I'm gonna have to come up with a totally different concept than I had. And so that was really the way I explored a lot of the world and Chronicles of Darkness was in LARP rather than in tabletop, which can make for a very interesting experience because there were some games I could go the entire night and never pull out my character sheet. And there are some nights where it's like, oh no, we're not doing any RP. We have stuff to settle. And just be in the side room with whoever was involved in that last combat scene or tracking down whoever was stealing from us and getting all of that nonsense together. It was quite a varied experience, and you learn a lot of very different lessons when you're in person versus when you're at a table.
Yeah, and it is. I have done the LARPing experience, and I did it as a teenager, and it was a very different experience, but it was a really cool way to enjoy the game, to appreciate the game. And I think that I feel like World of Darkness speaks to LARP. I think that there's something about the World of Darkness experience in LARP that it's something to be experienced unlike any other game. Like I have played in fantasy LARPs, I've played in Dungeons and Dragons based LARPs, and while they can be done well, I think that there is a certain amount of imagination required to do it. Like there's a certain amount of departure from reality that's required. Like you can do a lot of costuming, but still you're never going to have a real dragon on the battlefield. You're never going to have, even with all the face paint in the world, you know that it's a guy in costume. With all the prosthetics, with all the whatever, it's still somebody's dressed up in paint and makeup and all this other stuff. It's still going to have a certain element of fake. But with vampire, you can make it pretty good. Like you can do it pretty well, and the LARP environment is really fitting for World of Darkness. So the LARP experience takes World of Darkness a step further. So I think it's a game really, really fitting for the LARP experience, and I think it's a way to enjoy World of Darkness even further. So I definitely encourage everyone to try the LARP experience. However, World of Darkness also gained a really negative reputation because of the LARP experience. It definitely attracted a certain audience, a certain crowd that garnered a certain negativity towards World of Darkness. In your experience through the years of playing in World of Darkness, did you ever encounter that particular audience or that particular any kind of issues with that kind of crowd in any of your experiences? Because I know some people have and some people haven't, and I know that we've tried to curb that in the community as a whole over time. But I'm always curious from people's different vantages in their communities if they ever did run into that.
It was rarely the entire game. So you'll hear the stories about like, the storyteller and all the staff are in on it and they make the experience terrible for everyone involved. That was rarely something that I experienced. And if in the cases I did run into it, I was like, no, I'm not putting up with this. No game is better than this.
Right.
But there were often individual players who, even if they were mostly okay out of game, like they would have certain types of escapist fantasy that they very much wanted to play, but they were the types of escapist fantasy you really needed to make sure you had that kind of relationship with the person you were doing this scene with. And they were not great about that, to the point where like there were at least a couple of people who were sometimes asked politely, one asked very not politely to not come back again. But for the most part of things were pretty good. I will say that this is a slight judgment on my part of one of the major pitfalls, particularly for Vampire, is while I played all the different games, Vampire was the one that fell to clickishness harder than any of the others did. Occasionally to the point, and this is a thing I realized about myself after a while, and I had to purposefully stop myself from doing when LARPs got big enough. Because as I'm sure you know, when you have like 20 or 25 people at a LARP, yeah, we have a couple of storytellers, we can keep all these plots running. You get 50 to 100 people at a LARP, if storytellers aren't doing anything anymore, plots all on you guys. And I would have those moments at Vampire where I'm just looking around, I'm like, man, nobody's doing anything. I'm gonna go do something, and then I would become the problem.
Right. Yeah,
To the point,
absolutely.
to the point where at one time without context, I'm not going to share the rest of the story. Just have the audience going, "You did what?" Of the game ended with like half a dozen players in a panic because they were so lax about their security measures. I had set Elysium on fire and locked everyone in.
Jeez.
There was no context for this, and if I gave it, it still wouldn't make any difference. But like, just there was that look of I was left alone, unattended, and this is what happened.
What do you remember about your first character concept? Because I always am interested in this too. Like, what clans were you drawn to early on? I find that people are usually attracted to a certain clan at the beginning of their experience with vampire or werewolf or whatever splat they're drawn to first, because either they stick with that clan from the beginning until the present, or they end up shifting to another clan throughout the game because they find like, oh yeah, this was attractive at first, but then as I got more educated and learned more, I ended up, finding another thing was more suitable to my style or was more attractive to me. So what were you drawn to originally, and did you end up sticking with that, or did you end up finding something else that you liked more?
Yeah. For specifics, the first one that I played was, this is the Requiem version of the Nosferatu. So it's like I really of all of there are some changes I really liked from the old to the new world. There are some where I was like, you probably could have left that alone. It was fine how it was. I liked the idea of their Nos creep becoming more ephemeral so that it gave you a lot more freedom. Just be like, I'm not just ugly. There's nothing physically wrong with him. You're just really unsettled and you don't know why. And that was something I was enjoying. But, of course it was, the nightmare discipline is what really drew me in. I thought that was a lot of fun. And I was playing kind of an archetype that anyone familiar with like modern fantasy, modern horror would have of, the supernatural creature who is also a problem solver, who is a detective. And so that was kind of my shtick of the character who was deeply unsettling, but occasionally he would get a phone call from a frustrated cop or from, the one of the prince's lackeys who it's like, yeah, we need you to fix this. Yeah, it's like, there's no explanation as to why, just we have determined this is weird enough that we're willing to call you. And so that was kind of where I started, which was not the direction I've seen most folks who play Nosferatu go with. They usually go with, leg breakers and bruisers, and I played my share of those because I really love that archetype.
Oh, for sure.
But, it was particularly with World and Chronicles of Darkness, when I have a clan or a tribe or a kith or whatever it is that I pick, if I've told a story for them and I've gotten to complete that story, that's the important part of. I've had several characters, which gets into why I'm making a whole audio drama podcast, where if I get to finish their story, like I'm done. I've told that story. I've done what I can do with that concept. I don't need to do an encore. I will then move on to something else. But if I have an idea for a character and I really like a concept, but either the game fizzles out or there's a rules change, so I'm not allowed to have X, Y, or Z thing that was sort of pivotal to that concept, I will keep making that same character in different games until I get to finish. It's kind of that thing you have when you're in a conversation and you want to say something really important, but the conversation keeps wandering off and you have to keep dragging people back so you can finish. It's like that, but with a character sheet.
I understand that though. You want to get that satisfying conclusion. Like you need that closure, you need to hit that goal. And so you want to keep playing it out until you get that goal. You get that satisfying conclusion. Like you want to see the end of this thing. You want to see it hit that point. That absolutely makes sense. So did you get the opportunity to play through the end of that character or that arc?
I didn't, but he did metamorphosize and metastasize into something that, and again, for folks who have done LARPs, this is the thing that occasionally you begin to realize, particularly for large games, there's only so much power you have as an individual to affect things, and that's again, particularly with large games like when you have a big vampire game, it's why you end up forming cliques because you need like 15 of you to get this goal completed, and corralling that many people to do one thing is really tough. But it was essentially I had I believe the bloodline was the Novenji for folks who remember them. Of they were weird like offshoot bloodline that was able to grow fangs out of any part of their body and eventually like stab other kindred and steal their vitae, which I thought was fun. But they were, spies and assassins and whatnot. I wanted to take that basic idea of someone who knew all the ins and outs of the situation, who was a brilliant problem solver, who was really terrible at being a person, who saw a very convoluted problem and decided, I'm going to get a team together and we're going to fix this. And just have that moment of like, you can stop. I wasn't asking your permission. I was making a statement.
Right. So where are you at now in terms of clans? Like where would you say you currently are sitting, or where did you end up with in terms of favorite clans, or where are you sitting currently, or what, maybe I won't say favorite one clan, or favorite couple clans.
If I'm doing an old world game, I have always had a soft spot for the old world Gangrel, just because, Werewolf was the game I was more familiar with, and I love doing cross. Even if it doesn't show up in the game, I love having cross story. There was a for it's I've been accused many times of when I finish my backstory, I'll just have people look at me as, "Why'd you make it sad?" I'm like, "This is the world of darkness. Sad is what I do."
Right?
But
There's no
like I've
happy
all
endings in World of
no,
Darkness. I don't know.
myth.
I don't understand people needing that.
I mean, it is. I will say it is a thing that I do love about Requiem over Masquerade is the blood potency lets you play much older character concepts without getting super special permission to play somebody of a higher generation.
Makes sense.
Because I
Yeah.
love doing really old vampires who may not have done anything important. There's no one's killed them since they were made. But I loved the idea of a kinfolk who had been taken by a vampire, just to have that thing where he still has all that knowledge of the Garu nation, he still has all these traditions and all these things that he was trying to stand against, and he still is in his own weird, corrupted, worm-tainted way. And I've rarely had a storyteller want to do something with me on it, but it's one of those of I would love that confrontation of you have someone who is technically a lost member of your tribe, and yeah, you can revile them. They're like this because you screwed up. It's like your great 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 something or other messed up and let them be taken. So it's not just we hate you for what you are, but like we're ashamed that we let this happen. And I think that's a really fun dynamic, and it's something that you don't need to be immortal for it, but it does help.
Yeah. I think that'd be a fun story to tell too, honestly. Like as a storyteller, that would be actually a very appealing story to tell because it's not going so far as say a Samuel Haight, which I think is one of the greatest and grossest mistakes ever made in any storytelling ever. But it still has flavor, it still has depth, and it still has tragedy, which is all the great things about World of
Yeah.
Darkness that
Nom nom
I've
nom
always
nom.
loved. Yum, nom nom nom, yummy. But I do love cross splat, you know, tastiness of World of Darkness. I mean, that's one of the things that makes World of Darkness great to me is that it is a rich, full setting of all of these different things. They aren't segregated or separated. Yes, you can choose to focus on one element of it, but even within that element, they do bring in bits and pieces of the other elements. They do bring in tastes of the other elements in there. So to bring in those little blended bleeds over of the other elements is cool. But yeah, so the Gangrel would be your kind of your current favorite
Yeah.
or your most
Yeah.
recent favorite.
They're my comfortable place because it's one of those of sometimes I'll do it's a thing that folks who've played with me for a long time know I will occasionally do if I will deliberately costume or have an aesthetic against type so that it's a joke that I had for the longest time of I played a character who was a Ventru at the last vampire LARP I went to, and it was my personal goal to see how long it took for the rest of the venue to realize I wasn't a Brujah. Because he shows up, leather jacket, sunglasses, like a heater under either arm, like full hand of just rings, like rolls in on a chopper, and everyone's like, "Well, it's obviously this guy's a Brujah." It's like, no, he's a road captain. He's in charge. He runs these streets. If you want anything done around here, you go through him. And
Right.
it was that idea of kind of like the barbarian warlord is kind of the archetype I wanted to play with that, and I liked watching people who maybe like they didn't really think too deeply of like they have a very specific ideas is World of Darkness is really good at conveying archetypes in very fast snapshots, but oftentimes players will forget that those are the stereotypes are useful, but you can invert them and you can have fun with them, and it's a thing that I like to do. And that's kind of what I'll occasionally do. I'll pick a clan, I'll be like, okay, this is the way most people expect it to be. How do we change up that expectation while still remaining true to the core of what they are to sort of make people realize like, oh no, we are people like down below all of it of what clothes we choose to wear or what accent we speak in or what part of the world we happen to be from doesn't change like who it is that sired us or what traditions we become a part of, and that can often lead to a lot of really interesting and engaging questions when you ask, it's like, okay, you've been around for 300 years. You're older than America. What interactions have you had with people? Like, what? And that was again part of the joke of the character of Christopher Blood, of like, how did he become a vampire? Like, he was literally a pirate during the Gilded Age of Piracy. He was a
Right.
captain,
Yeah.
and he just found a random venture after he had been kicked off of his ship and left alone on an island. He was like, yeah, that was wrong what they did to you. Go get revenge, son.
Yeah.
He goes, don't die. Like, he hadn't seen his sire in like 200 years, but like that was the advice he'd been given. He was just following it.
Did you ever take the leap of being a storyteller yourself? And did that have an influence on you deciding to start writing material for the World of Darkness? Or did you just go from being a player to authoring World of Darkness material?
I went player, author, then storyteller.
Really? Okay, so
It was
take me through that journey.
all right. So like as a player, as I mentioned several times now, like I would create long, vast, ridiculous just histories for characters, huge elements that would never come up. They were just there for flavor, and I would hand them to my storyteller, be like, go ahead, do a thing with this if you want. And part of that is because I was aware, particularly in mid to large size LARPs, you kind of have to make your own fun in certain ways. If you can't expect a lot of one-on-one attention from the storyteller, like there's 20 other people in the game tonight, if unless you need something, don't bother them. Mommy's running game. And so that was kind of a thing I would try to do if I would include those elements so that I had things I could do on my own or that I could get other players involved in. Because when it's just me, like, hey, I'd like to do a thing, it's like, yeah, it's great, I'm busy right now. If I roll up with 10 other players or like half the venue are like, hey, we've decided that guy's a problem, we're going to go fix it. And they're like, ah, crap. All right, I suppose we're going to go do this then. And there were just lots of elements of that that either became running jokes or things that were just sort of fun that I put together, and I was like, all right, let's mess with this. Let's see what we come up with. It was actually Josh Heath, a fellow who was on a little while ago. He was someone I had worked with. I cannot remember what project we had first done together, but I was doing a lot of freelance stuff at that point, and I reached out to him and I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing some stuff for Werewolf. Would you guys over at, High Level Games be interested? And he's like, yeah, sounds great. Here's the kind of rates we offer. So I was doing one supplement every month to a month and a half of just 100 kinfolk. Just because, it was one of those of I was playing a lot of Werewolf and I was going back through all the tribes and all their history, and I was just coming up with family members, or I was coming up with unused character backstories. And it's part of the reason that a lot of my content, even if it's useful for storytellers, it always has an aspect that players could get something out of it too. And I figured those would be like, hey, I want to play a character who has a really deep family unit around them, but I'm not great at coming up with other characters. I'm like, here you go, 100 NPCs. Pick a couple that you like. Or you can have someone who is like, I really like Werewolf, but I'm not great at coming up with really engaging character concepts. Like, well, here you go. Any of these characters could become Garu. Pick one you like and customize it to like your own shtick. And there's even for storytellers, if you didn't just need the NPCs, several of them have just like little hooks of stuff that they've been involved in. Of like, here's this NPC who has like some Gnostic gifts, and they are connected to like this metis, and here's their deed name. They're like, who's that guy? He sounds really cool. I don't know. It's your job. Go figure it out. And so like those seemed really popular, so I just kept doing them. I think there's 15, 16 of them at this point. But, because those are doing well, obviously it's one of those, you're making a product, you have to keep reading the game books to see what other products might be useful. And I figured, well, people liked NPCs. What other elements do storytellers occasionally have where a player will be go like, hey, what's this thing? And then you have to rack your brain trying to come up with something to fill in that gap. That was kind of my goal of I wanted to save storytellers the heavy lifting so they could spend their creativity on other stuff. And a lot of things for I've actually been contemplating doing some more werewolf stuff for this, but I did a lot of Changeling the Lost products because Changeling is one of my very, very favorite games. But it's a challenge that folks had, for the hedge of it's ever changing, ever weird, it doesn't conform to the laws of normal physics. And you ask someone like, hey, make up some Alice in Wonderland nonsense off the top of your head. Go.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's a very specific skill set for people who can just do that off the top of their head. So my first thing was like, all right, here's 100 random bits of nonsense to just find in the hedge. If you're walking through the hedge and you want something to just unsettle your players or just be weird, here's some stuff. Whether it's like, this is an old phone booth, and as you're walking, it starts ringing. You pick it up. Probably not, because most players, when you describe that scene to them, are terrified. You know, there was one. It was a joke that I had of the Jungelskog, the giant teddy bear that they have from IKEA. It was just one of those walking through and there's a Jungelskog in a bush. Do you take it? It was part of the joke that I would write into lots of them of I wanted them to have that sort of grim fairy tale logic of always be kind first. That puts them in your debt. And so you present like a very obvious, like this seems like an obvious trap, but you always get the one player who's like, nah, I'm gonna put my hand in the trap, and then they get a benefit out of it. I actually used this in the LARP that I ran for a while of the player who took, the Jungle Skog. He wasn't just a teddy bear. If you take him back to your hollow, your place in the hedge that you can live, and you leave him there and you treat him well, he will clean it up when you're not there, and everything will always be organized, and he'll be a happy little bear. And that was really fun. The player really liked that. But because one player got that benefit, now everybody else is looking around wondering, oh, which of these are other benefits? I'm like, oh, they got lucky and picked the good one. Which one are you all gonna pick? So it
Well,
kind of becomes a little bit of a setup.
yeah, and that's one of the cool things that I heard when talking to Josh and Zachary a couple weeks ago. Which, if anybody didn't see that episode, I definitely encourage them to go back and watch. Storyteller's Vault has been such a blessing to storytellers like myself because it is a great resource to go to when you need those little things. Like as a storyteller who's been doing this for 30 plus years, we we can come up with a lot of ideas, obviously, but it's always nice to have a resource of just like I need just things. I need just a little font of little random encounters or random NPCs or stuff like that. And I love that there are people like yourself and like them who are just like, what's a need that needs filling? Obviously, like I've got these ideas. I've used them or I'm going to use them or I haven't used them and I'm not going to use them. And you just fill these needs. And obviously, you're monitoring the market and just being like, what's something nobody has done yet? And you do it and you create it and you come up with it. And I think that that's so cool because there's so many times that I've gone on that site and I've just been like random NPC generator or random werewolf NPCs, and there'll be a supplement for that. There'll be
Hmm.
something created for that. And it's so cool and so necessary. And I'm so happy to throw money at it. Like I'm so happy to create some like to do something for that. And I just think it's been such a valuable service. I constantly think, where was this when I first started? Like I so wish this was a thing. And I'm so grateful
Sadly,
it
we
is
didn't have
now.
the internet. Otherwise,
Oh
yeah,
my
it just would have
god,
been
right?
right there.
It's so great that it's a thing, and I'm so glad it exists now. The question that I asked them, and I'd love to pose to you, is with this new method of creating content, with this new option to become published, which is a beautiful blessing, it's also kind of a curse because it means that anybody can be published. It means that anybody can create things. How do you stand out? How do you make your product stand out so that you're sure that it's going to be noticed, that it's going to, stand out amongst all of the others? Because there is a lot of stuff on that site, obviously, and therefore it's easy to kind of get lost in the shuffle of all of the things that are on there. What do you do to kind of make sure that yours is the one that gets picked or yours is the one that fills a need or gets noticed versus all of the others?
The sarcastic answer is I be so annoying that people can't ignore me.
Okay.
But there's a tiny kernel of truth in the center of that. And part of this may not be something that lots of folks who are listening, who are maybe thinking on getting onto these platforms can do, because by the time I started doing specifically, Storyteller's Vault content, I had already been an RPG writer for a while. I had been established on various places on social media. I had my blog, Improved Initiative, that lots of folks might be reading. And so I had places I could go and I could talk about stuff where people knew me, they knew my reputation, they'd be able to see stuff I was doing, and they'd be like, oh, you've got a new one out. I'm going to take a look at that. But even with all those things aside, it's not just create a supplement, put it out there, hope it sells. It's, create the supplement and then create additional content where you mention the supplement, give people additional, like previews of it. It's one of the reasons I started doing the little World of Darkness audio dramas that are on the As a Kale Games YouTube channel is because I wanted to sort of hold true to that tradition that White Wolf would always do in the older games of you'd get a little story and then you'd get whatever the rule section was. And so I would, because I like having more word count because that means I get paid more. But it was also a fun little exercise because I wasn't doing as much fiction at the time and I really just needed something to scratch that itch. So I would do like 1,000 word short story intro, and then I would make a video of that that people could then listen to. And if they like that little story with all of its bells and whistles, hey, follow the link, go buy yourself a copy. Or then later on, I'd be on my blog and I'd be writing about whatever topic I'm discussing for the, here's how to run a better LARP. Here's how to, handle higher generate or yes, lower generation vampire NPCs. And at the end of it, I would always have that little section of like, hey, did you like this advice? Want some stuff for vampire or pentex or werewolf or whatever it was? Here's some supplements that I've done. Go check them out. So it becomes a not necessarily a hard sell, but it's a thing you can't just promote it once, hope it does its job, and then goes away. It's a thing you have to kind of bring up every couple of weeks, every couple of months, and sometimes it can get annoying, or you can misjudge your audience, but other times it's just you'll go. I occasionally have moments where I'll be on either Reddit or Facebook, and someone will tag me for something, and they'll be like, "Hey, does anyone know where I can get more like this thing?" And it's something I made, and I was like, "I haven't made sequels, but if you're interested, I could maybe get on that."
Yeah.
It's always nice, and it's a very weird experience. This is just a brief aside. Being a creator who's kind of hit that like minor league baseball of like people know your work, but they don't always know you. So when you interact with them, they'll be like, "Ah, you should read this thing." I'm like, "I did. I'm the guy who wrote that." And there's like,
I know
"Oh,
that
oh my
very
God, he
well.
walks among us." Like that's always a nice little ego boost.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, to be known but not known at the same time, to have your work mentioned to you, I'm sure is kind of a nice thing. Um, but yeah, it's also probably nice to know that it fills a need, but also that it's more of it is requested is probably like this is inspiring enough to make people want more, to request more is probably also it's always leave them wanting more is kind of what I've always been told in terms of the entertainment business is you can satisfy them to a point, but always leave them wanting more because if they're fully satisfied, that's where it dies. You know what I mean?
Mm.
If you fulfill the need completely, you can't keep selling. That's just the end of it. But yeah, what about oversaturation though? Because also on a
Mm.
thing like Storyteller's Vault, there's so much on. Some might say too much on there. Do you ever worry about that? Do you ever worry that there's just too much on there that it's not even worth trying to post anything, that it's not even worth trying to publish anything anymore on there because there's too much content to dig through to even make it worthwhile trying to post anything on there?
Yeah, a lot of that is going to depend on what niche you're going for, what game you're writing for, how many people there are. It's like I have had so many people request Wraith content, and it's like the one game that I haven't actually read, which
Yeah.
I feel really bad about because Tim Akers, one of the fellows who was one of the folks who designed it, has been on like a dozen panels with me, and I see him at least twice a year at cons that I go to, and I'm like, I should really read Tim's book. I feel like a bad friend. But it's just one of those of it's like if someone asked me like, "Hey, how many copies? Yeah, do you think you could sell 50 copies of a vampire supplement?" And I'm like, "Probably not, unless it's really big, or really bombastic, or there's like a huge need for this one thing, or there's like a fan favorite that turns up in it. People probably aren't really gonna want it." I've done half a dozen vampire supplements at this point. I did three supplements for ghouls, one for the cam, one for having a brain fart. Their enemies, whose my name escapes me at the moment, and one for animal ghouls because people keep forgetting you can have animal ghouls. And then I
True.
did one for havens of just like, hey, where are you sleeping? I don't know. Here's some. Take a guess. And then those did okay, but they didn't really have a lot of cascade sales over time. There wasn't people who saw it one time were like, ah, I'm gonna go get the other ones. So I just kind of stepped off of Vampire for a while. Whereas my Changeling stuff constantly every couple of months there's someone who gets one or two, and then a couple days later they come back for the rest. And part of that is because those are very different markets. Of coming up with an NPC list of ghouls is something most people can kind of do on their own. But again, like coming up with random goblin fruits that have bizarre effects in game, that involves mechanics building on a level that lots of people might not want to deal with. Or, here's like some bizarre hobgoblins that are completely inhuman in their design and their goals and their wants. Not every storyteller is going to be able to come up with something that feels like a refugee from a Grimm story, so they're more likely to just drop $3 on that. And then there's other games. Of I still occasionally get some folks checking out my Geist supplement that I did. Sometimes I'll get a couple of interested clicks on the one I did for Mage, but part of that is just, and of course the Kinfolk collections are always going well. Part of that's because they're in a bundle. So anyone who's looking for some insider trading, make sure that you have a deal, because people can't resist it. Even if they never use it, they're like, but it was only $1, so I bought it.
Right. Yeah, and that's another thing that I appreciate about Storyteller's Vault is I think that it's always kind of reasonably priced. Like I do appreciate the fact that it is fairly reasonably priced and that the authors do tend to respectfully price their goods, whereas a lot of the big publishers tend to, mark up the pricing, and probably for reasons. But yeah, I do appreciate that there are bundles and that there are options on Storyteller's Vault. And a lot of times it's like, well, if I'm already here and I'm buying this thing, I might as well add another thing on as well. And it does, it does add up, but it is worthwhile. I do want to tell you though, if there is something that you're looking to fill a need for, 5th edition werewolf content is in high demand because there's not a lot of it on there, and I would really like
Yep.
some.
Well, I suppose.
If,
And it is, there were enough changes, as I understand it, to 5th edition that I can't just wholeheartedly recommend my older stuff, because I know there were changes to
there
the
were a
tribes
lot.
and
There were
various
a
other
lot of
things.
changes.
So
Yeah.
while some of my old Apocalypse content will be useful, grain of salt, anyone who's just going to pick it up because they need stuff, not all of it will be changed. The characters will still be usable, but you might have
Yeah.
to give them a slightly different twist.
Well, and they say that the lore changed, but then they're bringing in some of the lore anyway. So I don't know. But it's still worthwhile checking out. I think that it's still worthwhile checking out because context is good and inspiration can still be found in old stuff anyway. It's still useful.
Absolutely.
And I want to talk about the editions in just a moment, but I want to remind people that we are still having a dice giveaway tonight. Those dice you see on screen now, they're green and gold. They could be yours if you live in the United States. You just put in the hashtag DiceMePlease in the chat. That's DiceMePLZ, and you could win those green and gold dice. If you live in the United States, they will be shipped to you for free. So put in the hashtag DiceMePlease, and I will send those dice to you for free. I will draw the winner of those dice by the end of the interview tonight. Those could be yours. Put in the hashtag DiceMePlease in the chat, and those will be yours. So you've played Chronicles of Darkness, you've played Old World of Darkness, and we talked a little bit about this before we went live tonight. You started to look at 5th edition, but you never really got into it. And it didn't seem like there was any real negative feelings about it. You didn't seem turned off by it. It was just a matter of you didn't really invest in it that much. You just kind of were not into it because it took away some of the crunchiness of the mechanics that you enjoyed about the older editions. So you were like, I've already got this, I'm going to stick with this, and stuck with the older editions. Was there any particular reason for that? Was there any issue you had? Like, what was it about 5th edition, aside from the simplifying of the mechanics, that made you decide to stay away from it?
A lot of it, honestly, is like there's the running gag I have of the changes that befell the Get of Fenris. It's just like, look what they did to my boys. But no, that's a thing I can take or leave. But it was really, the unfortunate truth is when you work in tabletop RPGs, you often don't get paid enough to buy the things that you create. And so it was one of those of, if I were to invest in a whole new rule set of books, because I've already got 2 or 3 shelves of classic old world books, because I have so many friends who have collected all of them and then they've stopped playing because they've either, gotten married or had kids, or they've just kind of outgrown the hobby, and they don't want to give them away like to a resale shop. They don't want to throw them out. So they live on my shelf now.
Right.
And so,
Keep them in the
I've got,
family.
yeah, so I've got all these resources in the event I want to use them, or if someone's like, "Hey, I heard you talk about like, those games from back in the day. Do you still have those books?" I'm like, "I absolutely do. We're gonna sit down and we're gonna do things the complicated way." But that was really what it came down to is would I use these other resources enough to justify the cost of acquiring them, or would it just be a thing I paid for and then read and then maybe could justify like using to create fresh content? And use because there is definitely a demand for fifth edition content. There's a lot of people who like that edition, but it was mostly just, a question of cost of is the return on investment going to be enough to balance out even getting digital copies of those books.
Right.
And so it was just one of those of I like reading new rule books, I like enjoying new lore, but there's so many games coming at my face all the time. I believe the last time someone asked me to look at fifth edition stuff, I was on a deep dive into Exalted.
That makes sense,
So
and that's a
so it was one
complicated game. That is a that is a
that
deep
was
dive.
that was one of those moments of like, no, can't talk, holding breath.
Right. Yeah. That is a well. That is a well you're going down. And I mean, it is, some say it is part of the world of darkness. So that is, I mean, you
It's
know,
covered by the platform. You can
it
make
is,
content
it
for it.
technically is, yes. But that is, yeah, that is a deep, deep, deep well, Exalted is. So that makes sense. Um, I know that some old fans of World of Darkness also kind of were put off World of Darkness entirely by 5th edition and the direction that they took 5th edition as a company. Did you feel any kind of feelings about that because of what they did with 5th edition or with the game structure at all? Did that kind of have any effect on you towards the game and in its existence?
It was one of those of, while I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of the controversies that were going on, of they popped up regularly enough that I was like, oof. It's like, I know you guys are legendarily bad about hiring editors to go over stuff, but someone should have caught that.
Yeah.
And so like there was a lot of those moments of just, I'm gonna wait and see how that goes. I'm gonna keep making stuff for the older things over here. I know what's wrong with these ones.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, it's like I am
exactly.
I am I am aware of what controversies I will hit making stuff over here. I don't know what I'm going to set my foot in if I try to do stuff over here. And while I'm sure that's kind of boiled, simmered down now at this point of, it's still just the time, the energy, the cost of bringing myself up to snuff on it because I have learned the hard way a couple of times that sometimes you can get away with just knowing enough of the old lore, getting a feel and winging it, and sometimes you'll try that and you will really mess it up, and that's when everybody sees it.
Right. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. It's funny too because I know that even like a big company like Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons still seems to step in it even now, even after all these years. And it's like how does this still happen? Like
Yeah.
how is this still, you have all the money. How is this still a thing?
Yeah.
It's
Is the question
just
rhetorical? Because I have an answer.
no, I'd be very curious to hear it because it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it is a thing that I have noticed for folks who have not heard me talk on the subject in other places. As gaming has become a bigger business and as we've grown, with things like, Critical Role now becoming just everyone knows that. Even if they don't play the game, they understand like the basic mechanics of how a D&D game looks and how it's supposed to feel. There's always the D&D episode of a cartoon or a TV show or whatever. It's well known enough that the public at large is expected to recognize it and know what it is. And so because of that, you have so many companies that are sinking in money and they're trying to like create bigger, better games, bigger, better products. But at some point, and we saw this very hard with Wizards, they started hiring people who are not from the tabletop RPG communities. They're not from that culture. They don't know what it is we want or need or what we will and won't put up with. And it's like particularly with the whole kerfuffle with the licensing that was going on a few years ago with D&D, of they were bringing in people who specialized in microtransactions for video games.
Mhm.
That is not a thing we will put up with, as they found out to their chagrin. And part of that was because they didn't understand the core concept of video games. You either give them what they ask or you don't get to play. Tabletop games, it's like, "Oh, you need to pass this, or I could just do it myself." What? Yeah, no thanks. And so that was kind of the issue they ran into of their business model expected behavior A, and when they didn't have the information necessary to realize they couldn't force us to buy the product, they floundered. And I'm seeing that mistake happen over and over and over again in creative venues of companies are either charging too much or they're bringing in experts from related fields who don't have a background, so they don't realize that what they're proposing, if this was, World of Warcraft or this was Diablo, people would grumble, but they'd put up with it for a game where we only buy a product if it saves us enough energy to be worth the cost. They're just not going to put up with that. And that's, again, gets back to why certain things do really well on these platforms and others don't. Of most of the supplements that I've mentioned I've written go for like $3 at the low end to like $5 at the high. Most people are willing to like drop that range of money for something. It's like, I never have to mess with this again. Phenomenal. But if it's, it's like, I want you to pay me, $5 every 2 weeks, whether you're playing the game or not, in order to keep access to this content. No, it's not happening. We'll
Right.
print it out, we'll write it down, we'll do whatever, and you can go off that way.
Yeah, it's just it's wild to me. Like even the in the culture where we've become, I think, more sensitive than we've ever been. Because I think it's easy to look back at old content with a sensitive lens and be like, that's offensive. And it's like, well,
Oh boy.
it was written in the 90s.
Yes.
We weren't
Yeah,
as
it
sensitive
should be.
then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, it's
Yeah.
offensive. You can
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
back at stuff written in the 50s and be like, well, they shouldn't have done that. Well, yeah, it was the 50s. Of course they shouldn't have, but they didn't know. Or they did know and didn't care. Like it was a different time period. But now we do know and it's still happening. That's different. Like that's
Yeah.
how that happens. The issues we have now still happening. That is what is killing me, is that we do know, and how are we still stumbling? How are we still having issues with the content that we're writing? And it's supposedly going through so many hands. So many people are supposedly reading it, supposedly checking it, supposedly editing it, printing it, rereading it, sending it out, shipping it, like all this stuff. All of it, it's going through so many hands, and then it's being caught and
Hmm.
criticized and burned and like, taken back and reprinted and all. Like, how is that still an issue? I don't understand. I don't understand how it's not caught quicker and stopped before it's even being put on the shelf in this era. Like
So
I don't understand. Like I still see editing mistakes in the 5th edition books that are hitting the shelves, and I'm talking about stuff as simple as grammar mistakes. How in this era are we still having that when we have word processors that point out spelling mistakes? We have things like it's all being done for us now, to the point that we don't even need editors to tell us that is a word is spelled wrong. How does that still hit the shelves? How does that still
yeah.
happen?
It reminds me of a phrase. There's a guaranteed editing trick for anyone who's thinking about writing a novel. What you do is you write your novel and then you put it through 5 layers of editing, and then you do all your layout, and then you read it again, and then you publish it. And then once it's been on the market for about a month, pick it up and turn to a random page, and you will find that spelling mistake you should have fixed.
Yeah.
And
It's
a lot of it is like it's no one problem, and this is the thing we're seeing in publishing all over the place at this point. It's unfortunately not just RPGs, or we could just criticize that industry, but there are so many folks who either they're skimping on actual editors and they're trusting that the computer knows what it's doing, which is how you end up with like words that are not swear words being changed into something that's really offensive, or it's how you end up with like, well, it uses British spelling over here, but American spelling over here because we had them on two different computers and then we smooshed them together. Or you have people who are like trying to use generative AI to edit it because they don't want to pay an actual person. As any one problem by itself isn't a huge issue, but the bigger the company, the more of these changes come into place, and then you smoosh, and they just become a weird little wet, drippy, moist sandwich.
yeah. So I have a question, and this maybe you can
Absolutely.
answer this as a writer, as a long-term World of Darkness fan. When are they going to be able to lay out a rule book correctly? When are they going to be able to organize a rule book in an order that makes sense?
It will be the last book that the company puts out before they declare bankruptcy and are wiped from the face of the earth.
Okay, that makes
Just,
sense. All right,
just,
that's
just to show that they knew the whole time, but this was actually a long con to get us to buy the updated, edited versions because once we found the mistakes, we couldn't unsee them, and they knew it would drive us crazy.
So Mage Fifth Edition, got it.
Yes.
Okay. No, that totally makes sense. So I want to talk about some of your currently running products, some of the stuff that you've got going, because you've got so many amazing things that you're doing right now. And the first one that I want to talk about is your audio drama, because I got to listen to just a few minutes of it, and it's one of the coolest things that I've seen. Like, I've listened to a few audio dramas, and this is a really cool project that you've got going. And I know that you are working on funding it through Patreon. You have episodes on YouTube. I'd like you to, however, kind of tell our audience a little bit about it and kind of get them to go listen to it. Give them the sales pitch on it, because I got to listen to it a little bit, and it is just a really cool, unique World of Darkness product and a unique take on World of Darkness product. And yeah, go. Just tell them about it.
Absolutely. So I'll give folks the short version, and then I'll give them the behind the scenes of what's going on. So what I want to do for Windy City Shadows, working title, is I'm going to do one full complete season, which is not going to have any cliffhangers. We're not going to leave anybody wanting. It's going to be 10 episodes. I'm aiming for half an hour to 45 minutes per episode, and it's going to follow one specific story. And for folks who are wondering about terms, this is specifically an audio drama. This is not a live play. No one's rolling dice. There's no improv. There are scripts and sound effects, and everybody's playing characters. And the immediate elevator pitch is Changeling the Lost does John Wick. Of our protagonist is a former Paladin of Shadows, which, for those not familiar with Changeling, is kind of the enforcer for the Fall Court. Of whenever something needs to be fixed or broken, you send the Paladin, and then the job goes away. And he did this job for many, many years, and Black Shuck was the name he was known by. Of when he showed up at your door, you immediately knew you had made a mistake. And he didn't want to live that life anymore, and he retired and has been quietly running a bookstore on the south side of Chicago, minding his own business for the past couple of years, until somebody pulls out, a favor that he owes. So he has to put on the coat one more time and get this one red mark out of his ledger so that the court will finally leave him alone. And as we follow him along on this case of, it's essentially trying to find someone who's gone missing with something that the queen wants. It's a very basic, someone stole my loot. And the more he investigates, the more and more convoluted this is going to get, until we're going to realize no one is in the right, and lots of things are getting very complicated very quickly, which is bad news when you're a beast and aren't good at thinking about things in complicated terms. But for the behind the scenes, to explain to folks how this project sort of became a thing, of many, many years ago when I started, putting out the Changeling the Lost supplements, as I mentioned, I would put little bits of story in them. And after a while, rather than just doing random intro stories, I was like, what if I did like a little trickery in the background, a little Dark Souls deep dive lore, so anyone who gets all of these supplements gets a little continuing story, and they get to follow all of the little story beats as we're going on. And so I started developing a little narrative from story to story, and I started introducing different characters, and just having them deal with things that you would encounter in the supplement. We follow around a very large one-eyed ogre named Jacoby as he deals with everybody else's mistakes, and everything is his problem. He's very sour about it. And at some point, we see Jacoby meet a fellow summer courtier of his, a guy named Wolf, who has clearly been beaten up pretty bad and needs to get out of the city fast because fall is coming for him. He doesn't tell his friend what it is he did. He doesn't mention what happened. He just offers him a favor if he'll get him out of the city. So Jacoby shows him a back door into the hedge, and then decides, okay, hands washed. I'm done with this. I don't want any trouble. And that sort of became the seed for where this idea came from, because Wolf is the one who stole something from the Fall Court, and nobody's seen him for weeks. And so we eventually call in the favor to put our hunting hound on him. But the whole reason it came to this point is I was originally just going to keep these stories going in little shorts, but with changes for what my publisher was putting out and different costs that it was taking to do, Storyteller's Vault products, it kind of became not a really great return on investment for me to keep those supplements going. So both that and the story I was doing for the Geist and Mage crossover, which I was having a lot of fun with, were just kind of left hanging. So my idea was if I put this podcast together, I could at least finish off those two stories. I could tell my audience, here's what happens with Wolf and the mysterious item that he stole and the fall courtier, Lucius, who wants the property back. And then if that does really well and people enjoy season one, season two, I want to finish the much more ambitious crossover, which is, there is a recently awakened mage who is the son of a mafia boss in Chicago, and he essentially put out a hit on one of his old shooters. Unfortunately, the people he sent didn't get the job done in the right way, and Johnny has formed a pact with a Geist known as the Six Gun Saint, who has an issue with what's going on here. And so I want to explore why the Saint is so mad, why he's driving Johnny back to Chicago to bury this hatchet, and what the local mage community is going to do when they realize like this upstart who's causing us problems made a serious enemy, and he is slowly getting all the major ghosts of Chicago on his side to just take him out.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. Like I was a huge fan of Port Saga, which was another audio drama set in the Vampire the Masquerade universe, and I thought it was such a unique and interesting way to introduce people to the world of darkness. Like it had lore, it had context, but it was a story. It was just a story format. Like I loved the old World of Darkness novel series that they had back in the 90s and early aughts that you got to be able to read because it was a way to digest the world of darkness without dice, without actual play. And it was a way to introduce people to it and then be like, hey, it's also a game that you can play. Also, like the video game route of introducing people into it. So I think audio dramas are a great way to do it as well. I've never played Changeling. I've never, absorbed any of that lore. So I think this is a great way to introduce somebody into Changeling or to get them interested in the Changeling concept. So I love the fact that this is an option that's becoming available, and I think that's so cool. I think that that's so cool. It's such an ambitious project to do, and I think that it's such a cool thing that's coming. And I really do want to see it in its full evolution be out there because I love to see alternative takes on the world of darkness still being made, still existing. Kindred the Embrace, the TV series, people had their opinions on it. I love that it exists. Even if it was cheesy, even if it was ridiculous, I love that it exists. I would love people to make a Vampire the Masquerade series now because I still think it could do well. I think that I love seeing the universe continue to expand, the world of darkness continue to grow in new and exciting mediums. So I love that this project exists and I want to see it flourish. So I want to encourage people to go help fund this thing with your Patreon, which we will plug in a little bit. Another thing I want to talk about is Discussions of Darkness on your YouTube channel. Talk a little bit about that because I think that's a cool series that I got to check out a little bit of. So tell people about that.
Absolutely. I started that many years ago at this point. It's been at least 2 years learning how to do YouTube, which has just been a thing. But for clarity, for folks in the audience who are wondering, Azukale Games is owned by that publisher, and Adrian Kennelly is actually the fellow behind it. I'm just the face on the camera. But he sort of reached out to me when I started writing a lot of my Sundara Dawn of a New Age stuff, which is a fantasy setting for D&D 5e and Pathfinder Classic. And I was doing a lot of World and Chronicles of Darkness stuff for him at that point, and he's kind of poked me and said like, "Hey, I have this YouTube channel where we kind of put previews for my stories, just so I can have them on Drive Through RPG if people want to just look at the supplement, flip through the pages digitally and whatnot. What if you made some videos about the stuff that you're doing?" And so those started getting a little bit of traction. I made some early audio dramas, which are, ooh boy, they are clunky to go back and listen to them now. But that's the same thing with any medium, any art you do. If you go back 2, 3 years later and you're like, oh, I was trying my best, wasn't I? But Discussions of Darkness was kind of my way of keeping some of my supplements in front of players while also either explaining, here's the reason I made them, or here's the need that they fill, or here's an aspect of the game that isn't often used, or here's some mistakes as a storyteller you should really avoid. Because one in particular that I think might be one of the most popular episodes at this point, I think it was episode 3 or 5, one of those two. But I have had lots of long discussions with both storytellers and fellow players about whether or not the World of Darkness is a horror game or whether it is a dark fantasy game. And the answer is, which one do you want and how are you running it? But there were so many people, it baffled me for the longest time. I've begun to get some insight into it, but it is a very weird feeling showing up at a vampire LARP or at a werewolf LARP where there's 20, 30 people and you're the only horror fan there. And I'm just kind of looking around. I'm like, what do you mean none of you watch horror movies or consume horror content? Why are you here? I'm glad you're here, but why? Explain it to me like I'm 5. And it basically boils down to, wanting, different things out of the game, wanting different kinds of, power play experiences, things like that. But for those who wanted to put horror into the game, oftentimes folks will have a very specific idea of this is what horror is, which completely overlooks the fact that horror is very personalized. Of you can have something that completely freaks out one player, and another player is just going to shrug and be like, it doesn't really bother me that much. And so you have to kind of customize the experience to what everybody wants. But a lot of the time, storytellers, especially if they're not familiar with the tropes of horror, if they're not familiar with storytelling tropes and how to build tension, things like that, they'll just go for, like, I'm going to do this thing that I know makes my players uncomfortable, or I'm going to do this thing that's just shock value. And that has destroyed so many games that I've either been a part of or that I've watched, or lots of people I talk to are like, no, I don't like horror games. And they would tell me about a storyteller who, they had watched like Saw 3 and they decided, like, I'm going to make my next session that. I'm like, you didn't check with your players that that's what they wanted? Don't do that. Don't do that
Right.
to anybody. I wrote a Black Spiral Dancer supplement. Don't do that.
No. Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
And so that was just kind of like advice for, like, how to take the table's temperature. Like, here's how you talk about the topics you do and don't want to see. Here's things you ask beforehand. Here's things you check on afterwards. And other things of just like, don't get so caught up in X, Y, or Z thing and think, well, it has to have this or it doesn't count. It's, what do you want to do? What will affect your players? What will build tension? What will build dread? And those are things that, like most storytelling tropes, and whether you're at a table or you're behind a screen with, with a keyboard, it takes practice, and it's a thing that you have to actually think about. You have to get yourself in that headspace in order to execute it in the way that you want, which is unfortunately not something a lot of storytellers are really good at. They want to be able to just get that quick punch in and then they're done, instead of building it up 4, 5, 6, an entire chronicle's worth of sessions.
It's interesting that you mentioned the not liking horror thing, because I've had this debate with people in the past. I consider myself not a fan of horror. However, I've had to dissect this thought process for a while. And
It's
it's
a
only
curious thought
because it is
process.
a curious thought process, because I realize it's not that I'm not a fan of horror. It's I'm not a fan of a certain type of horror. And I've broken this down. I've really broken this down. I don't like jump scares and the over reliance of jump scares in horror, modern horror. I like thrillers. I like mental horror, psychological horror. I love That's how I run my games. I don't have things jumping out. I don't have things like the type of horror I tend to avoid. I don't tend to bring into my games. But I love psychological horror. I love monster horror. I love that kind of stuff. And so that's the stuff I tend to play with in my games. So to say that I'm not a fan of horror isn't true, but that's what I usually fall back on, because that's the horror I'm used to seeing now. That's the horror most movies do, is they usually have the jump scares. So I'm just like, I don't like horror, because that's what I'm used to movies relying on now. So when people say let's go see a horror movie, I'm like, no, I'm not going to, because I know that's what it's going to entail, because that's what they expect in all horror movies now. It's going to have that, so I'm just not going to bother. I know, like, That's my trauma. So I just why bother? But
That is the thing I'm curious about because we had a little while ago we had the oh what was the word for it? It was essentially like the art horror revolution or the art house horror movie revolution we had, you know, with I don't want to give away the ending of the movie to describe it. Word. It's refers to a family bloodline, usually a curse that's handed down.
oh my god, what is
Yeah,
the?
you know the one I'm
Yeah,
thinking
yeah,
of. You
yeah,
can see the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
cover. Um,
Oh, Hereditary.
Hereditary, yes, like
Thank
with
you,
you know
Pizzazz.
Hereditary and The Witch and you know The Lighthouse and movies like that, where it was like, you know, I remember my description of The Witch. It was like, what makes you know what's this movie about? It's like, okay, so nothing happens for like an hour, and then a bunch of crazy white people absolutely lose their minds at each other, and then the devil shows up. Just, what? Yeah, that's the movie.
Yeah,
Huh? Yeah, but it was a thing that because I watched it, you know, in theaters the first time, and I was getting really tense, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized at the end of it, it was very masterful and very subtle sound design
hmm,
of like nothing is actually happening, and because nothing is happening, there's that tiny little noise that tricks your brain. It is like something's coming. What? I don't know. Figure it out. So
yeah,
you're looking everywhere on the screen of what is it? What's happening? Nothing's happening. Like, yeah, we have a minimalist budget, like four people in costume and a goat, but we're making you think something's happening. And I'm curious to see how that generation of horror movies influence the way people are interacting with the world of darkness now, particularly with games like that fit themes like demon or mage or various other ones.
absolutely, absolutely. Now I want to kind of talk a little bit about the future of World of Darkness. Then we'll get back to some of your other projects that are going on because we're going to kind of venture out of the World of Darkness talking about some of your other projects. So we're going to wrap up our World of Darkness stuff. Then we'll talk about some of your non World of Darkness stuff. The future of World of Darkness. So, 5th edition, we've seen Vampire, we've seen Hunter, and we've seen Werewolf released. Mages, hopefully in the distant future. I don't think so, but hopefully. Because I think that once Mage is released, it's all downhill. Um, they've had an interesting release of versions, and I know you aren't necessarily as up to date on 5th edition. Maybe that's something we could talk about remedying after we go off air, because I'd love to get your take on some of it and maybe your help with getting some more content for it. But we'll
Hey.
talk about that separately. Um, they've done an interesting pattern of release. When they released Vampire first, no big surprise there. It's the biggest release they've
Yeah,
had.
vampires always first. That's the
Always
way it
first.
goes.
They released Hunter second, which was an interesting choice because it
That is
was,
unusual.
yeah, it was.
Yeah, hunters usually like the cleanup
It's
act.
one of the last ones. But
Hmm.
it was interesting because mechanically it was a cool bridge that they took to take them to Werewolf. Because one thing that they've done mechanically in 5th edition is everything is using the same mechanics system, which they did not do in the old system. They
Yes.
have, and they've incorporated some of the Chronicles of Darkness system
Yeah,
in
that is the
it.
reason I will always love Chronicles of it
Yeah.
makes crossplay so easy
And
for
they've
all
done
of
it.
its other flaws.
Yeah, they've done that in 5th edition, which is something I really appreciate. So they released Vampire, they released Hunter second, and they've released Werewolf third. So what I'm hoping with this strategy is after Werewolf, which was a big release, obviously, it's one
Hmm.
of the three pillars, Vampire, Werewolf, Mage being the three pillars, that they're going to drop another interesting bridge release, like maybe a Wraith or a Changeling, to work out some of the mage mechanics before dropping mage. What do you think about that, or where do you see World of Darkness going from here? Do you think that's a possibility in terms of their release strategy, or do you think they're going to do something silly like drop mage next to try and make a quick buck and therefore potentially wreck their chances of helping the franchise flourish further in the future?
'Cause unfortunately, I think that is probably the more likely thought process. Hopefully, cooler heads will prevail. Because you know, when you tell a room full of suits, we're like, okay, here's the one that'll make the most money, but we can't release it first. They'll just demand to know why. I think Changeling would make an interesting bridge, partially story-wise, assuming they kept the very heavy connections between dreaming and the realm of the Fianna through the Umbra. That would literally provide you a backdoor from one game into the other. But it also kind of introduces the idea of, pledges and word binding and magic that doesn't really make sense in the way that, like werewolf and hunter and vampire does, of like they have very easy to explain magic systems. A vampire is like, we drink the blood and then the blood powers the magic and we do vampire stuff. And like they've because of the success of Masquerade, it's the way so many of us think about vampires now. Of if you bring up like pre-Masquerade vampire lore or fiction, people are just like, "So what's that? I've never heard of that." And then, Hunter is also very self-explanatory of like this is how you hunt supernatural creatures. We have like what 14, 15 seasons of Supernatural. We know how their powers work. And then, we have Werewolf, which is more convoluted, but it still makes sense. Of you get, spirit of X thing, you feed it into something related to X thing, it creates Y result. Whereas Changeling can sometimes have a little of that orange and blue logic that also plays very much into Mage. I think that if they are doing the long plan, as you mentioned, Changeling is more likely because I think Dreaming has a larger fan base than Wraith, even if it's not necessarily a louder one.
Well, that's an interesting point because as somebody who is versed in Chronicles and Old World of Darkness, there has been an interesting debate among Changeling fans, which is there is a call from some people for it to go the direction of the Lost and some people to go the direction of the Dreaming. Now, World of Darkness has taken an interesting perspective on this in the fact that when Werewolf came out, they said, we're dropping canon. We are resetting canon. We're saying that everything that happened in Old World of Darkness, we're dropping it. We're cutting it off. We're saying it didn't happen. We're resetting Werewolf canon and starting out brand new when we release Werewolf, which they've kind of tiptoed around and backed up on and, so on and so forth. But that was the original intent. And even in the first few books of the core book, they said that. They said that in the first few pages. Whether that's
Bold
true or
decision.
not. Yeah. So there is precedent that they could do that with further supplements, with Changeling. If they wanted to say, Changeling the Dreaming isn't a thing, we're deciding to bring in Changeling the Lost instead as the official Changeling of 5th edition. Whatever. What would your preference be for which Changeling they introduced with 5th edition? Did you have a favorite version of Changeling?
I do. Lost is always my favorite, if for no other reason than my super short sales pitch to it, because we all have that one game that we will get annoying about to some of our friends. Changeling is that game for me. But it was Call of Cthulhu's Vigilante Superheroes is like the way that I explained it to people, that they're like, okay, I get it. And I like the paranoia of Lost. I like how you're still essentially mortals dealing with trauma, looking for community, all of those themes that fit really well. But I don't feel that it should subsume the old world when it already exists perfectly well in the new. Because Dreaming also has a lot of those themes of there's like searching for community in a place that, doesn't understand you. There is a world of banality trying to crush like the last beautiful thing left in your soul. These are also very important themes that can be explored in Lost, but that's player decision, not canon decision. And so I think both should exist. I think it would be a mistake to overwrite Dreaming with Lost, if for no other reason than I have met more than my share of Dreaming players who have no interest in Lost, particularly because of how bleak it can get. And it's like they like that Dreaming is kind of that last dancing flame of hope in the old world, where it's like no matter how grim or dark or awful all the other ones get, we are going to be here and we are going to play music and we are going to have a good time, damn it.
Which makes sense. I think that was what kind of turned me off about Changeling, weirdly enough, but I also was the goth kid who loved World of Darkness, so I was like, I want all my games to be dark and depressing. And then they said Changeling is colorful and happy, and I was like, no, fuck that. But
you can make it colorful and depressing.
Colorful, yeah. But it also makes sense that they did have one last hopeful alternative but it also does have its elements of depressing in it as well. So yeah, I think maybe both, maybe a little bit of both. We'll see. Uh, I hope they do. I hope they do give Wraith and Changeling their chances to shine before they release Mage. I think Mage is the potential setting killer because if they screw it up, there's no coming back. If they release the wrong mechanics, if they don't test play it out, if they don't, because Mage is the reality changer. It's
Hmm.
the if you do it wrong, there's no backpedaling, there's no going back. Like if you release the wrong rule system, how do you fix it? How do you don't. That's it. That's all
It
they
was
that's your
good
goal.
try.
Yep,
Back to the drawing board.
that's it. So I hope that they really take their time with Mage and that it's the last thing they do because once it's out, it's out. Like once the three pillars are built, who's gonna want to buy the smaller games? They're not. That's gonna be the end of the money train for them. So we'll see. But I want to talk about your other projects. You've got your blog, Improved Initiative. Let's talk about that because that's cool. You've got a lot of cool posts on there and links to a lot of other cool projects that you're working on. Let's talk about that, and I'm going to post that up when we're doing plugs at the end so people can see it. Tell people about that.
Absolutely. So I was looking at it the other day. I am coming on 10 years since I started that blog, which is why it's still on blogger.com and I refuse to move it.
Yeah,
But yeah, the joke for it originally was this is way back in the day is gather around the Snapchat children. We're gonna tell you a story of the old times. But it was just after like Patreon had really come on the scene and kind of given creators a way to be crowdfunded. And so I was like, well, try that out. I have things to say about. I originally started the Literary Mercenary, which is my writing blog, but I was like, well, I have gaming thoughts too, so I suppose I'll share some of those as well. And of course, the gaming blog just took off massively. So I'm like, well, this is the one we're following. The other one is now secondary. But the title is a reference to one of my favorite scenes in the Gamers 2 Darkness Rising where we bring in our girl gamer who's the ex of one of the other guys who is that guy that we all hate dealing with. And she actually read the rule book and came up with a completely broken character combination, which starts with it's what is it? It's like if you go first and you deal a critical hit, you get it like a free shot on everyone within 10 feet of you. And so it just becomes this massive, overpowered killing machine. And there's that line from everybody else who just took whatever the standard was, who never bothered reading the rules of who takes improved initiative. And the answer is usually me. I'm that guy. I want to go first, and I'm going to be a jerk about it.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And so it was kind of where I wanted to start. For folks who got that reference, is I wanted this because this was during the heyday of like Pathfinder Classic. Fifth edition was still in playtest at this point. We were getting some stuff that didn't make it into the final version, which was an interesting experience to see. But I knew that the game was so dense and there were so many options and so many things you could do, and that is where the little spicy chemicals in my brain get happy. So I'll find ways to do weird, unique, strange things, but if you don't have the time to read 17 rule books and put together all these different feat trees, you're not going to come up with them. So I would just get on there and I would tell my audience like, "Hey, I found a thing to make this viable. Go check it out." Or it's like, "Hey, have you ever wondered what this character would be like in this game? Here's a build I made. Okay, back to the mines." And so I just did that for a while. And for folks who want to check it out, it is completely free. There's no ads on it anymore because ads are dying. Everyone has ad blocker. It's a pain for people reading. It's a pain for me. I don't even bother anymore. But nowadays I'll use it to like help promote myself and other creators who have stuff coming up. I need to do another post for Owen Stevens. Speaking of, shout out to his Kickstarter or not his Kickstarter, his GoFundMe for anyone who hasn't checked it out yet. But I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about stuff you can do as a storyteller, or I'll come up with unusual character concepts, which is more riffing on the stuff I mentioned earlier of like here's a character concept that takes a class archetype or something we're all very familiar with and just pushes it in a different direction you might not have thought of. One I had was the recent one I did was the beer brewing witch for Pathfinder. It was just that idea of like the witch is very mystical and very kind of difficult to grasp if you want to make it not just an old hag with a weird cat. And so I had that moment of like, all right, take the witch with all their spellcasting glory, Now make them that guy who's really annoying about microbrewing. There's your character concept.
Love it.
And so it's just like a very blue collar way of coming on a spellcaster and just sort of giving that to folks to be like, here's a really random idea, run with it and see what you come up with. And then I usually in the comments just like ask people of like, if you use these ideas, tell me. I want to hear the stories and I want to know how they turned out.
That's amazing. I love that too. And I love that you have a blog still. Like, honestly, I just think that's so cool because I remember back when everybody had a blog. Like, that was the thing to have. And then those died off. They were replaced by websites, they were replaced by people's social media. But I still think it's such a unique thing to have, and it's still helpful. Like, it's still worthwhile to have. And I was going through and looking at it, and one, I got nostalgic. Not gonna lie, it made me actually want to stay on the page and do a deep dive because nostalgia alone. But also, there was just a lot of really neat, unique things on there. So I'm actually gonna bring up the site now for people to see. You can find Improved Initiative at taking10.blogspot.com. And there are links to several other pages there, including his Amazon author page, where you can find some of the books that he has to buy, including several Pathfinder supplements on there. But there are some cool posts on here, including some of the other things that we've talked about tonight, including the audio series that is working on. But there is a lot of just amazing information, not just related to specifically World of Darkness, but just TTRPG stuff in general. So go check out Improved Initiative. It's just a very, very cool read if you're into TTRPGs in general, and it's a great way to support our guests tonight. But go check out that page. It's just a really, really cool read, and I found myself just getting lost in it. Is there any other projects that you want to tell people about tonight? I want to give you an opportunity here to just plug anything else that you're working on before we do our dice giveaway and put a bow on this thing.
Sure, sure. For folks who maybe caught the previous episode with Josh of Army Men, a game of tactical plastic is out, and I am doing my very best to keep putting out content for it. It's the an unfortunate reality a lot of us have to deal with of Kickstarters and big projects are how we get a lot of money, but you don't always have the time or the energy or the content to make big books. So I'm trying to put out a lot of smaller supplements. I started a recent show on the YouTube page for folks who are curious about it of Tactical Plastic Report is going to be just me going into the lore of the setting and talking about all the weirdness and the nonsense where living plastic people fight like giant bugs for the safety of their home and country, and there might be things like robots and aliens and a whole bunch of other nonsense going on in the background. Let's see. Other than that, I have several novels, as you mentioned, of my what's the official list of tags for it? It's a dystopian sci-fi thriller in the vein of folks who have ever read Space Marine stories and wished they were detective thrillers. This is the book for you. Of Old Soldiers is about a decommissioned super soldier who is attempting to live his life in the bombed out ruins of the post-apocalyptic world he helped save from alien invasion. And it's difficult to live your life in a world that was never meant for people like you. And when he starts seeing connections and wondering if someone's trying to assassinate him, he's also aware that his head is not a safe or reliable space anymore. So this might all be made up.
So like Halo
And
meets Dick Tracy.
yeah, a little bit. And
I
then
love it.
for folks who like noir but they're not really down for the dystopian setting, there are two novels in my Hard-Boiled Cat series, which is The Maltese Falcon, but if all the members of the cast were street animals in New York City. Yeah, our protagonist is Leo, who is a hard-bitten Maine Coon tomcat who lives in the alley behind just a I think it's a butcher shop is the official place he lives, and it's just people coming to him with their business, and he just has to deal with it. So if you've ever wanted to see like an angry Maine Coon deal with coy dogs and other stray cats, and his best friend who belongs to the barista across the way, who is an adopted former pit fighting dog. Of Doc is an absolute treasure, and I hope to write a novel about him and his experience at some point. But
That's
yeah,
so amazing. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, but like it's like all three of those were recently, we'll say in like the past year or so, like given a full re-release. You can get those, and if folks really like those, I am more than willing to sit down and do more novels. And for folks, last thing for folks who like audio dramas, who like Space Marines, who like Warhammer 40K, check out the channel of Ox in the Void. Paul Graham does amazing work, and several of the short fan stories that I have written, for him and just in general, have been narrated there. Several of which are getting new installments. So if you're either a fan of the Imperium's bravest Ogren, Gav, and his adventures with the Inquisition, there should be a new Christmas story for that soon. And there's a new installment I'm working on for Waking Dogs, which is my tale of a world eater who has decided, to wake up and choose violence on targets that no one expected today, as he's decided, like, I'm done following what people in chaos are telling me to do.
Oh, that's so cool.
I,
Uh,
lo- I love Crixus. He makes me so happy.
that's so cool. And I love that you're working on so many projects simultaneously too. Like you've got to stay busy all of the time, but it's so cool to have so many creative endeavors going all at once. I have a problem with hyper focus. If I get into something, I put all my energy in one basket, but the fact that you can have all of these projects going at once is amazing, and that you can just keep all of these plates spinning, I guess, going all the time is great. And the Army Men game, I really do have to check that out because we did have our guests on 2 weeks ago that promoted it, and it does sound like a really cool endeavor. And I do want to see how that progresses and see that succeed because it does sound like a really amazing project. And now that we've had three of you on who worked on that project, I do want to see how that goes. So that's really great. But before we go, I want to do our dice giveaway here. For those who've been putting the hashtag Dice Me Please in the chat all night, you're going to win those green and gold dice. One of you is going to win those dice, I should say. Not all of you, because I only have one set of them, so I couldn't give them away to everybody. But anybody, we're going to do the winner of those dice tonight. So the winner is Dat Bardic Charm. Abby, congratulations. You win those green and gold dice. So I'll be in touch with you to get your shipping information so that I can get those dice shipped out to you immediately. Congratulations, Abby, on getting those dice. Thank you so much, Neal, for being my guest here tonight. This was an amazing conversation. And like I said, we barely scratched the surface on the things we could talk about. I really appreciate, and I can speak for the whole community, all of the contributions you've made to the world of darkness and to TTRPGs as a whole. I mean, you guys are the unsung heroes of the TTRPG community because writers, where would we be without them? Honestly, like the books and all of the supplements. And yes, we have the rule books, and those get us so far. But we also have all of the supplements, and as storytellers, as dungeon masters, those are so invaluable because the rule books give us structure, but when we need those extra additions, when we need a little bit more, I know I have gone to places like Storyteller's Vault for that little extra oomph I need to help boost my story up, for a little extra incentive, for a little extra inspiration. And finding stuff like the stuff you guys have supplied has been so invaluable. And I know players have too when they're looking for something to spice up their characters or for something to give them a little bit more. Writers like yourself have made that happen. And your upcoming audio drama helps keep things like the World of Darkness relevant. When, Chronicles of Darkness came out, I thought the World of Darkness was dead. I thought Old World of Darkness was over. And so now it's still alive because of people like you helping keep it alive. And so I want to say thank you for that. And I want to say good luck on all of the future endeavors that you keep working on. I'm going to be supporting on them and cheering you on, and also all the other things that you're working on. So thank you for that. And I really appreciate you being here throughout this whole process.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been lovely talking to someone who's at least passingly familiar with some of the stuff I'm working on. It's always nice having someone else who's equally enthusiastic about stuff, 'cause it's occasionally easy to forget when you're in the room doing stuff all by yourself that there's actual people out there who are enjoying the things that you make. And it's always nice to just come out and see that, like, as much as you may want to, give up, or you might be done with an idea and then you see people who really enjoy it and you're like, well, maybe I could do one more.
Well, we're going to talk afterwards about potentially maybe getting a few more than that in the near future. But if you like the conversation we had with Neal tonight, there are plenty of places that you can go find them and support the work they're doing. First, head on over to YouTube and subscribe to Azakale Games. You can find it at youtube.com/@Azakale Games. That's where you can find the Discussions of Darkness series, as well as a whole slew of videos that you can find. Lots and lots of great content to be viewed there. There are a lot of great videos to watch with that handsome face you've been watching all night long. There's just a lot of cool concept to digest there. So go give a subscription to Azakale Games. You won't regret it. There's just so much really cool content there. I've been watching, and I'm going to probably continue watching after this episode is over because there's just so much to see there. That being said, also head over to Improved Initiative, taking10.blogspot.com. This might be worth bookmarking. Honestly, there's a lot of cool posts to read there and a lot of handy tips and links there, including unusual character concepts. I know that I have found myself struggling more than once to come up with a character concept for a game, and Neal's done the work for you. So there are some cool options there, as well as links to gaming supplements, the Amazon author page we talked about, and some of those cool stories that Neal was mentioning earlier. It's a one-stop shop or link tree of sorts to all of the amazing work that Neal has been doing. So head over to taking10.blogspot.com for kind of a homepage that links you to all of Neal's other work. And then you can also find Neal at vocal.media/authors/Neal-Litherland. Sorry, I'm drying out on the mouth here. For some of his audio work, because he also does audio work. Actually, Neal, if you want to take a moment to talk about that, that would be really helpful as well. I feel like we didn't even get into that.
Sure. Vocal.media is for anyone who has attempted to become a professional writer these days. In the long ago and far away, there were websites all over the internet that would track your progress of how many reads you got, and then they would just cut you a check based on how many people read your articles. That has kind of fallen by the wayside in the days of Patreon and Kickstarter and various other crowdfunding platforms. Vocal.media is probably the only website I've come across where if you read articles, if you listen to various whether it's audio dramas or music supplements or whatever it is that somebody has posted on there, they track your activity and just pay the creator. So if you want to support someone who makes cool stuff, but you don't have a lot of spare money in your budget, you can read articles, you can listen to what they've put up there, and it's completely free to you, and it still helps them pay their bills at the end of the month.
See? Go support Neal there. And then finally, we mentioned Patreon. Go support Neal on Patreon, patreon.com/the Literary Mercenary. We want to see that audio drama come out. This is the best way to support it. You could go join for free, but also there's a $1 a month Patreon level there. Just go join that. It's $1 a month. It's the cost, well, was the cost of a soda back in the day. I know they're way more expensive now. So it's a lot cheaper than the cost of a soda these days. Go support. Maybe we can get that audio drama funded and out. I know I'd love to see it. So go become a part and a supporter of that audio drama on Patreon. And let's get this thing made, because I know it would be really cool to see, and it'll make more content for the World of Darkness as a whole. But once again, Neal, I can't say it enough. Thank you so much for joining me. It was a real treat having you here. And thank you to everybody watching at home. For Neal, I'm Kent. Go follow St. Pete by Night on all of the social media listed down below. And if you're interested in the World of Darkness, why not join our community? We've got the Discord link in the description. You can come check out some of our one-shots, maybe join one of our tables, or you can just come lurk in our community. We're talking about the World of Darkness, and we've got a lot of friendly people there that you can meet and just nerd out with, and, talk some crazy TTRPG stuff with, and maybe find yourself in a game or two along the way. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you soon. After Dark is over for the year, but we'll be back next year. We're going to retool the program a little bit, get some new guests, get some new things lined up, but enjoy the holiday season, and we'll see you next year with some new After Darks and some new guests. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a good night, everyone.